Welcome, everyone, to today's Sims online lecture. I know that people are going to keep coming in. It's just noon. So maybe we'll wait. Well, now it's 12:01 according to my clock, so I don't want to wait too long. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the introduction, um, and then we will really get started. My name is Dot Porter, and I am the Sims Curator of Digital Humanities. And I am here with my colleagues, Nick Herman, who's the Schoenberg Curator of Manuscripts, and Lynn Ransom, the Sims Curator of Programs. And this is today's Sims online lecture, which is brought to you by the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. In addition to the monthly Sims online lectures, we also host weekly manuscript show and tell, Coffee with a Codex. We edit the Manuscript Studies Journal, which is published through Penn Press. And on November 20th through the 22nd, we will be hosting the 18th annual Lawrence J. Schoenberg Symposium on Manuscript Studies in the Digital Age on the theme of interpreting the ancients. And if you would like to know more about any of those programs, one of my colleagues will be putting links into the chat, so you can find out more there. Our next Sims online lecture is The Guide to Goodness, an Islamic medieval bestseller, copies at Penn and their contexts, which will be presented by Ali Nouri, who was one of our Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies visiting research fellows this year. That event will be on Zoom, again, on Friday, December 5th, from 12 to 1:30 p.m. And again, there will be a link in the chat if you would like to register for that. Without further ado, I'm going to move along and introduce today's speaker. We are very pleased today to have J.D. Sargan. J.D. Sargan specializes in medieval English literature, paleography, codicology, and the history of the book. His interest in the haptics and handling of books led to his work investigating binding structures using scientific imaging, which is an issue that is also very close to the Sims heart. His research in this area has been funded by the Leverholm Trust, Zeno Karl Schindler Foundation, Chris and Margaret Lendrum, and the European Union's Horizon 2020 Marie Sklodowska-Curie Independent Research Fellowship. He is currently Assistant Professor of English at the University of Georgia. Dr. Sargan is the co-editor with Hannah Riley of the Routledge Handbook to the History of the Book in medieval Western Europe, coming out with Routledge next year, and is the co-editor with Micah Goodrich of the medieval volume of the Cultural History of Trans Life, coming out with Bloomsbury in 2027. Today, Dr. Sargan will be presenting work from his new book, Trans Histories of the Medieval Book, an Experiment in Bibliography, which will be published by Arc Humanities Press at the end of October. It received the Medieval Academy of America's Inclusivity and Diversity Award, which will enable the book to be available in gold open access, which is great news for Dr. Sargan and for everyone else too. So Dr. Sargan, please.
Thank you, Dot. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to wave the copy of the book around because it arrived on Friday in a box. And that's my pitch to you all to buy it. There'll be a slide at the end of my presentation. Let me just share my screen with you. Okay. Records, Michelle Caswell tells us in her 2021 manifesto book, Urgent Archives, if conceived of and activated for liberatory aims, have the power to change ourselves and the world. Caswell situates her call within a critical movement that aims, quote, to extricate archival theory and practice from the constraints of the oppressive systems in which it is rooted and for which it has been a tool. For Caswell, quote, critical approaches to archival theory and practice are unabashedly emancipatory in aim, emphasizing the structural and interlocking nature of various forms of oppression, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy foremost among them. In this talk, I address the medieval objects that we find in the archives and how we deploy them in support of or resistance to structures of cultural and political power. Trans studies, I suggest, is one method by which we might negotiate with the structures of power that we have inherited. Most of us on this call have, at one point or another, come to recognize that the archive, here conceived as both the space in which records are kept and the curated collection of materials within such spaces, is a political space. In the national and institutional archives of Anglophone countries, choices are made about what is collected and in what condition it is preserved. These choices have shaped and curated a version of history that privileges certain white, cis-hetero, masculinist stories over certain others, those of Indigenous Americans, for example. Much as it may worry the current administration, renegotiating collecting and hiring priorities in favor of greater institutional diversity will not, by itself, function to disrupt those narratives. The problem is also structural, and structural problems require structural and methodological solutions. How a collection is labeled or catalogued, where it is kept and in what condition, who may access it, where and when, these are all decisions made by people with structural and institutional power. Critical archival studies uses postmodern critique and activist praxis to surface these choices and the power structures that inform them. Where critical bibliography sits in relation to those approaches is a question that remains under negotiation. In my work, I like to think of critical bibliography as a response to a question posed by Leah Price in her 2006 article, Reading Matter. What if, instead of asking what book history can do for literary criticism, we ask what literary theory can do for book history? Critical bibliography, Lisa Maruka and Kate Osmond suggest in the introduction to their 2023 special issue of Criticism, quote, explores how critical theories can reshape our histories of the book and bookish objects, and in turn, how bibliography can be used as a tool to resist oppression. Like critical archive studies and crit lib, critical bibliography takes its cue from critical theory, the emancipatory mode that developed out of the Frankfurt School into the parallel discussions of, for example, queer theory, disability studies, critical race studies, and eco-criticism. Critical bibliography engages theory to critique or criticize the field of bibliography, its methods, materials, inclusions, and exclusions, to formulate new approaches to bibliographical materials that redress such exclusions, and to deploy both of these things to liberatory ends. In his keynote at the 2021 annual meeting of the Bibliographical Society of America, Derek Spires asked, what use does bibliographical study serve in a moment of national reckoning, once again, with systemic racism and white supremacy? The term liberation bibliography was coined by librarian Barbara Pfister and draws on the work of liberation theology, an approach to Christian theology developed by Latin American and African American communities that emphasizes social justice as its core mission. Liberatory bibliography, Spires explains, is the, quote, conscious and intentional practice of identifying and repairing the harms of systemic racism, settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and other oppressive structures in and through bibliography and bibliographical study. Books and their histories, he suggests, can be a path to justice and to freedom. However, methodological change is needed to make that happen. Quote, some elements of current bibliographical practice may well be incompatible with liberation bibliography, precisely because they are premised on erasure, devaluing knowledge systems, or perpetuating colonial archival practices. Critical archival work, Caswell insists, should offer alternatives, imagining new ways of thinking about and doing archives that emancipate rather than oppress. If there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from this talk, It's that there's liberation to be found in the medieval archive, and that that liberatory framework can improve our methodological approach to the field. In my work, I make a case that trans studies offers emancipatory tactics for navigating and circumventing the oppressive logics baked into bibliographical method. Trans studies is suited to this task, I suggest, in part because this task is exactly what trans studies was developed to do. According to Susan Stryker, the cultural historian and co-founder of the journal Transgender Studies Quarterly, trans studies is, quote, concerned with anything that disrupts, denaturalizes, rearticulates, and makes visible the normative linkages we generally assume to exist between the biological specificity of the sexually differentiated human body, the social roles and statuses that that particular form of body is expected to occupy, the subjectively experienced relationship between gendered sense of self and social expectations of gender role performance, and the cultural mechanisms that work to sustain or thwart specific configurations of gendered personhood. The production, transmission, sharing, saving, using, and disposing of knowledge in the form of written media is one such cultural mechanism. Trans studies developed in response to a need to unpick the ways that media objects produce, perpetuate, and police normative binary gender formations. Trans studies approaches, then, are bibliographical. As the quote I have taken from Stryker might suggest, I use the term trans in its most expansive sense. For Stryker, any person, quote, who moves away from the gender they were assigned at birth, people who cross over, trans, the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain that gender, might be trans. Stryker's approach highlights that gender is a culturally and historically situated experience. Stryker formulates transness as an open analytic through which to understand categories of gender and sexuality have been imposed in various times and places, identifying those that subvert such categories and learn from their methods of resistance and survival. Florence Ashley considers trans to be one of a range of gender modalities. The concept responds to the legal and medical need to distinguish between a person's sense of gender at any given time and, quote, how that gender identity relates to the gender that they were assigned at birth. The term modality shifts the focus from gender as identity, which trans and cis women, for example, may share, towards gender as a process of crossing over into the etymology of the word trans that allows us to understand trans as a methodology for cutting across the binary formations of gender and sexuality produced by cultural institutions. Modalities signal ways of being in the world, quote, a mode or way of being one's gender. In recognizing the processual nature of both trans and gender, we can understand trans as a method of investigation as well as a subject for investigation. For the word tactic, I'm indebted to Ingrid Nelson's Lyric Tactics, Poetry, Genre, and Practice in Later Medieval England. In Tactical Practices, Nelson says, drawing on the work of Michel de Certeau, quote, subjects find unauthorized, spontaneous, and makeshift pathways among institutional structures. Middle English lyrics, Nelson suggests, use, quote, tactical reliance on the departure from institutional forms of textual production to shape itself into a distinct kind of literary object and to reform the structures that shaped it. So, I'm not proposing here a need to abandon or give up on traditional modes of book historical inquiry wholesale, although, like Spires, I offer suggestions about where such methods might need rethinking. Rather, I posit that trans theory can be used to navigate, supplement, and provide alternatives to work around such methods in ways that anticipate, identify, and reject or defy histories of exclusion. So, For the rest of this talk, then, I'm going to do three things. First, I'll look at some aspects of the history of book historical studies that I think demonstrate the way that cis heterosexist and patriarchal power structures are baked into the structures and methods of the field. Second, I'll think about some of the ways that the field might be otherwise. I'll look to the growing field of queer bibliography to offer a roadmap and offer some preliminary tenets for my approach. Finally, I'll offer an example, building on the work of Michael Sargent and rethinking the way we visualize manuscript relations. In what follows, I'll focus my attention on medieval manuscript studies. I would describe myself as a medieval book historian, so my training and research have led me there. However, as I'll return to later, similar considerations are underway in other areas of the field, so I hope any non-medievalists on the call will still find something useful in the considerations of the role of textual objects discussed here. So, first, part one, an introduction to books history. Roberta Magnani and Diana Watt, in the introduction to a special issue of Post-Medieval on queer philology, categorize medieval book history and textual criticism as a field, quote, dominated by masculinist discourses. They note that, quote, a rhetoric of heteronormativity, repronormativity, and patrilineality is deployed to group manuscripts into families of originals and derivatives. These derivatives are, in turn, chastised for their inferior and corrupt status, which removes them farther away from the fetishized authorial original. Such rhetorics, Magnani and Watt point out, act as barriers to inclusion, shaping the demographics of the field by signaling who is welcome and who is not. But this is not just a question of politically correct language policing. The rhetoric that Magnani and Watt observe is a symptom of the legacy of the field's development in cis-heteropatriarchal imperialism, and it impacts how we think about what we do with our books. When editors, like Sir George Warner in his 1889 edition of the Book of John Mandeville, describe manuscripts as defective, Tom White has found, their use of the word is, quote, underwritten by the essentializing pseudoscientific abstractions of social Darwinism. Warner's work was heavily imbricated in contemporary colonialism. He edited the Mandeville for the Roxburgh Club, an elite literary society with membership limited to 40, mostly imperial politicians and members of the landed aristocracy. And, White has shown, Warner cannot help but see his book as a precursor to British imperialism. Warner's use of the term defective invokes the late 19th century language of disability, and with it, according to contemporary pseudoscience, the heritable features of race. The language, of course, is dehumanizing, both to the scribes who produced these variant manuscripts and to modern readers and users. It has also limited scholarly attention to a large group of Mandeville manuscripts due to their perceived status, less important, substandard, further from a conjectured original, preventing proper engagement with the variation that they have from one another on the basis of one perceived commonality. White, alongside other scholars like Hal Momer and David Matthews, and scholars like Adam Miyashiro, Mary Rambaram Ulm, and others working in the wake of the 2017 white supremacist marches in Charlottesville, Virginia, have analyzed the field's foundational white supremacy. The medievalism evident at the Charlottesville rally is just one of the ways that the modern far right has looked to an imagined medieval past to legitimize white supremacist cis-heteropatriarchal political beliefs today. But they participate in an extended tradition of white imperialist medievalism. 18th and 19th century European philologists, these scholars have shown, were interested in producing a national literature that portrayed contemporary empire as the natural inheritance of a fantasy white masculinist heroic tradition, and paleographical analysis formed the basis of their work. Doing so involved, in White's words, the construction of a national corpus purged as far as was practicable of its defective elements. Such defective elements include sexual and gender minorities. As Gabriel Bykowski has noted about the rediscovery by Ruth Mazocaras and David Boyd of the record of the questioning of Eleanor Reichner, a trans woman working in sex work in 14th century London. Karras and Boyd found the record of Reichner's questioning in the edited calendar rolls of the mayoral plea and memoranda rolls, the edited calendar of the mayoral plea and memoranda rolls, where it had been elided by the coy 1930s editor and read only, quote, examination of two men charged with immorality, for whom one implicated several persons, male and female, in religious orders. To the historiography charted by these scholars, I want to add two things. First, I want to make explicit that, beyond its use in support of textual criticism as a necessary precursor to the job of editing, manuscript studies has its own investments in white cis-heterosexist imperialism. And second, I want to demonstrate that those same investments come hand in hand with investments in scientific racism and sexology. The formal study of historic writing often traces its roots to Jean Mabillon's De Re Diplomatica. Mabillon's six-book volume was published in 1681 as a rejoinder to a dispute over the authenticity of a diploma of Dagobert I raised by the Bollandist Daniel Paperbrook. It constitutes the first attempt to present a comprehensive history of handwritten Latin script, classify and describe its identifying features, and provide instruction on dating and authentication from a range of external and internal features. Book 5 is dedicated entirely to paleography. For Mabillon, the categorization of script was a crucial tool in the management and security of those great regulators of bodies, the church and the state. The urge to turn these techniques to the policing of nation and culture began early. In 1704, George Hicks incorporated numerous plates depicting different dated samples of script chronologically arranged, which he used, quote, to identify post-conquest intrusions into and fabrications of Saxon documents, lest the knowledge and reputation of Saxon language, customs, and laws be vitiated. Paleography training entered university education in the mid-18th century in the form of diplomatic. By 1765, Johann Gatterer had incorporated diplomatic into his theorization of universal history. Gatterer's book, Elementa Artis Diplomaticae Universalis, introduced to diplomatic a classification system inspired by Linnaeus's formalization of binomial nomenclature in the natural sciences. Gatterer viewed history as a system that could be sorted, standardized according to shared dating conventions, and arranged diagrammatically into a model of world events. Diplomatic was an essential building block in that schema and required regularization if it was to prove effective in dating and locating the documentary record. Just as botanists identified plants by the absence or presence of component anatomies, so Gatterer used components of script to date and place manuscript documents. These components were tabulated according to time and place. History, as envisioned by Gatterer, could also be a Präzierte Wissenschaft, a precise science. In 1784, Thomas Astle stated in The Origin and Progress of Writing that he intended, quote, to illustrate the diplomatic science, the knowledge of which will enable us to form a proper judgment on the age and authenticity of manuscripts, charters, records, and other monuments. By the 19th century, paleography was widely referred to as an ancillary or auxiliary science. Paleographical Society was founded in November 1870 by Sir Edward Augustus Bond and Sir Edward Augustus Bond and Sir Edward Morn Thompson. Elaine Treharne has charted the interest shared by both men in the use of the growing science of photography to catalogue, compare, and distribute paleographical samples. Both men also served as principal librarian to the British Museum, and in 1888, Thompson became the museum's first director. In that role, he funded collecting expeditions to Mesopotamia, Egypt, Cyprus, Ephesus, and Carchemish, and contributed to Sir Aurel Stein's second trip to Central Asia. He was in charge when the Benin bronzes, now characterized by lawyer Carsten Stahn as, quote, the public face of colonial injustice, were looted by British forces in a punitive exhibition to Benin City, present-day Nigeria, in 1897. Paleography's cultural imperialist investments and its ongoing claims to scientific method intersect in critical ways. In the mid-19th century, the natural scientific typologizing that paleographical classification was based on turned its eye to the classification of humans. Just as scientific racism employed ostensibly measurable characteristics to assert the, quote, truth of racial difference and to justify colonial violence, philologists and paleographers used the veil of measurable scientific data on historical language and script to assert the cultural and linguistic superiority of modern English and to support colonial language and cultural policy. The same period marked the advent of medical sexology. Through the collection and publication of case histories, medical sexologists sought to classify so-called deviant genders and sexualities, at this point considered holistically through the lens of sexual inversion. In 1886, Richard Freiherr von Krafft-Ebing published his Psychopathia Sexualis, the study credited with reclassifying sexuality as an observable scientific phenomenon. While Thompson was taking possession of the Benin bronzes at the British Museum, the 1897 edition of Havelock Ellis's Sexual Inversion presented 34 new case studies of British inverts. As Siobhan Sullivan discusses, parallel developments in the scientization of race and sexuality, quote, were not only historically coincident, but in fact structurally independent and perhaps mutually productive. Medical sexology, whether sympathetic or condemnatory in its attitude to homosexuality and gender transitivity, exhibited the same drive to pathologize and thereby regulate non-white, non-cis heterosexual bodies through measurement and categorization. The question of sex, Ellis wrote, with the racial questions that rest on it, stands before the coming generations as the chief problem for solution. The first chapter of Sexual Inversion is dedicated to cataloguing incidences of inversion found in nature, which Ellis extends to a range of non-white human cultures, prompting his conclusion that, quote, deviant sexualities were prevalent among the lower races. Incidences of sexual diversity like these provided a framework for gender and sexual normativity to be constructed against. Non-white races were not considered sufficiently developed to be classified according to binary sex. Meanwhile, white inverts, James Kiernan argued in 1892, were the subject of atavistic reversion, which returned them to a shared undeveloped sexual state. The intersections of race, gender, and sex in sexological thought return us to colonial medievalisms and their modern counterparts. For Ellis, quote, true inversion in Europe could be traced to the Renaissance, furthering a cis-heterosexist idealized image of the medieval as a time when men were men. For England, Ellis, like his colleagues in philology and paleography, takes the Norman conquest as a starting point for moral and demographic decay. Edward Freeman, a scholar of the Norman conquest, explicitly coupled Norman inversion to the racial imaginary. In 1882, he wrote, quote, Vices before unknown, the vices of the East, the special sin of the Norman, were rife, and deepest of all in guilt was the Red King himself. Into the details of the private life of William Rufus, it is well not to grope too narrowly. In him, England might see on her own soil the habits of the ancient Greek and the modern Turk. For these scholars, just as for the unright un, just as for the Unite the Right marches, pre-conquest England was a homogeneously white, patriarchal, cis-heteronormative space receptive to masculine heroics. It is perhaps unsurprising, given the views he expressed, that Havelock Ellis was a member of the Eugenics Society. However, you might be more surprised to know that he also edited early modern drama, heading up the Mermaids series, which launched in 1887 under the strapline, The Best Plays of the Old Dramatists. So, while manuscript studies' involvement in medical sexology may be less overt than its colonial interests, notwithstanding the intrinsic enmeshment of the two, the influence of sexology and the power structures that it supported remains visible in the ways that manuscripts are categorized, measured, and discussed in terms of descent, genealogy, and relationality. Manuscript studies may no longer seek inclusion among the physical sciences, but the scientizing of paleography, its enmeshment in the imperialist taxonomizing of philology, sexology, and race science, have methodological import too. Sonia Drimmer, Elaine Trahan, and others have explained the impasse produced when scholars come to different conclusions on the attribution of scribal hands while citing the same conditions of measurability. Now, this critique is not a stick with which to beat the field. I'm not looking to undermine the values of specialist training in areas like paleography, codicology, or languages. However, I want to acknowledge that inheritances, both linguistic and methodological, from the field's early interests curtail its appeal, relevance, and availability to many demographics. As long as manuscript studies continues to be dominated by masculinist discourses, Magnani and Watt observe, the field will remain elitist and conservative. In short, the field's early investments continue to play out in how the field has developed, in what questions it is possible to ask, and in how it is possible to answer them. Part 2. The shape of transbibliography. Or I called it on my slide, models of queer and trans bibliography. Either will do. The history and development of the field that I have charted today is not the only option. In any book, in my book, I think about the scholars whose work offers opportunities for counter-histories. Women, people of color, queer people, Black feminist scholars and activists have shown us the value of counter-histories to constitute what Lisa Lowe has termed a past conditional temporality, one that offers alternative considerations of how we got here to present a much more complicated set of stories about the emergence of the now. We might reflect on the value of the past conditional, the tense of past possibility, as a response to the gaps in non-white, non-cis heterosexes archives and historiographies. Counter-histories present a field that could be otherwise, that might be more open about its investments, less susceptible to patriarchal assumptions, think more transhistorically and transregionally about the past, and acknowledge the reciprocity of our relationships with it. However, in this talk, I want to turn from looking at the field's past to thinking about its present. My approach to transbibliography owes much to the growing field of queer bibliography. As Sarah Pike and Malcolm Noble point out in the introduction to their 2024 special issue of PBSA, queer and trans people have always engaged in bibliographic practice. We might think, as Noble and Pike do, of Stephen Gordon in Radcliffe Hall's 1928 novel, The Well of Loneliness, whose queerness, figured by Hall as sexual inversion, implicates both gender and sexual non-normativity. "I must be a boy," Stephen tells the housemaid Collins, "because I feel exactly like one." Reading her father's marginalia, which she finds in a copy of Krafft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, prompts a recognition that both registers the queerness she already feels and shapes the path for the rest of her life. Reading the signs of her father reading sexology, for Stephen, shows her that she is always already queer. Queer bibliographical labour and expertise, Noble and Pike show, have always existed in professionalized and amateur forms, even if queer bibliography is only now emerging in a new disciplinary formation. Queer people understand the power of texts as material forms to shape, share, and transmit identity. And queer readers develop the ability to read with, through, and counter to the form of the book in order to identify material likely to provide self-recognition. For modern queers, intuitive approaches to the identification of queer content might include, quote, poring over covers, colophons, and card catalogues, decoding, chasing clues, following tenuous thread of connection from material text to material text. For many queer bibliographers, the intuitive material approaches they developed as young people led to formalized studies of book objects that foreground the haptic and affective qualities of that engagement. In other places, I have suggested that pre-modern queer and trans people also understood the power of the material text to construct gender and sexuality through active embodied use. The presence or absence of trans lives in the documentary record has primarily been theorized by librarians and archivists. Research in this area can be divided into several key themes. One concern is access. It does not matter whether material is in an archive if no one is able to find and use that material. For material to be findable, it must be catalogued and tagged using appropriate and comprehensible terminology and/or equipped with clear and non-pathologizing bibliographical classifications, the call number that designates where a book is to be filed on a shelf. Access, KJ Rawson observes, is also about the space, shape, and time of the archive. Archival space shapes how researchers interact with the records. The Sexual Minorities Archive, Rawson suggests, where archival objects are permanently on display with minimal interpretive metadata, presents a model of discovery in which objects are allowed to speak to the researcher, quote, embracing a different kind of satisfaction that recognizes that a collection can have desires and want to be touched too. Similarly, the lived-in archive presented by Tom of Finland House puts visitors in intimate relation with the erotic art and ephemera on show, blurring the distinctions between archival objects, household tools, tongue-in-cheek playthings, and ephemeral pornography. Rawson posits that alternative modes of archival access, like these, constitute, quote, a queer revision of traditional historiographic method that is based on the ways that researchers feel archives and desire history, and the ways that archives and history feel and desire right back. The reciprocated touch of the archive, famously figured by Caroline Dinshaw as the, quote, queer historical impulse towards making connections across time, complicates the linear temporality presented by Western historiographies, especially in the hands of transgender researchers whose identification with archival materials may carry shame born of current oppressions in lieu of the pleasure of recognition. Finally, such spaces are negotiated by embodied subjects. My work takes its cue in particular from Susan Stryker's reminder that, quote, embodiment is not only animates the research query, but modulates access to the archive in both its physical and its intellectual arrangement. Rawson and Charles E. Morris III recognized the reciprocal relationship between archive and body in their formulation of the archival queer. Archival queers, quote, resist the archive as a purely intellectual space and seek out effective relationships with the past. As I have suggested elsewhere, Embodied experience is a crucial stage in the acquisition of knowledge. Trans and queer bodies accrue across their lifetime a shifting range of experiences unavailable to their cis-hetero counterparts. The embodied experiences we bring to the archive and the effective resonances they facilitate are fundamental for recognizing alternate ways of knowing. Noble and Pike's introduction converts these archival considerations into a series of preliminary precepts, intellectual and ethical, intended to delineate expectations for queer bibliography as a subfield. Queer bibliography centers affect and embodiment. Queer bibliography intuits. It amplifies the minute material, paratextual, and textual signals steering receptive readers in the right direction. It listens to silences very carefully. Queer bibliography is messy and speculative. Queer bibliography takes place inside and outside universities, libraries, archives, and other institutional settings. These tenets remain true for trans book history. Trans studies shares the queer commitment to liberation from normative frameworks of gender and sexuality. However, I propose some additional parameters of my own also, using Noble and Pike's model as a starting point, but guided by the particular, sometimes divergent interests and approaches of trans studies. For Stryker, trans studies was born as queer theory's evil twin, disrupting and refusing to stabilize the gender systems on which sexuality is built. I take special note of trans studies' particular interest in the processes and techniques of embodiment. Queer, Heather Love comments, has proven less useful than transgender studies in accounting for embodiment. Trans studies makes accounting for material experience and making space for new forms of and experiences of embodiment central. As KLM Keegan elucidates, trans studies recognizes gender as necessarily materialized. It is entangled with embodiment, not simply a system of sanctioned and recognized performative acts. Keegan writes, and I thank the careful work of Caden Henningsen and Liz Ott for this distinction, that, quote, queer studies' privileging of language over materiality has meant that it often interprets bodies as if they were texts, whereas transgender studies' attention to corporeality means that it often treats texts as if they were bodies. This formulation, Ott suggests, quote, shifts the gendered body away from ontology and towards phenomenology. Gender stands in relation to when and how it is embodied. Finally, as Andrea Long-Chu and Emmett Harson-Drager hypothesize in their State of the Field discussion after trans studies, transness knows what it is like to make and break norms. Quote, what it means to be attached to a norm by desire, by habit, by survival. Trans studies offers more ambivalent approaches to what is normative and how community might be constructed in, through, and around normative modes. So, for me, transbibliography reveals normative models. Transbibliography fosters connection and community formation. Transbibliography emphasizes process. Transbibliography is materially engaged. Part 3. Stemma, cladogram, rhizome, cloud, constellation. This section of the talk takes its title from a chapter written by Michael Sargent. In this chapter, Sargent proposes that the rhizome provides a more effective model for manuscript relations than the traditional genealogical stemma. I want to take Sargent up on this proposition and extend it first by offering a secondary critique of the rhetoric of Lachmanian stematics, and second by contextualizing the use of the rhizome as a model through its use in queer and trans critique. Finally, I'll propose that the act of constellating provides a way of analyzing this relationship that the manuscript rhizome sets up, and I will just do that in one sentence at the end of this talk. Lachmanian stematics posits that, by comparing scribal variants across a textual tradition, it is possible to understand the manuscripts of that tradition as related families of objects. Carl Lachmann developed this model as both response to and support for the creation of critical editions. Stematic modeling is based on the comparison of manuscript variants, and its outcomes help scholars and editors decide which readings to privilege and which to amend in the quest for the text. Many of you will be familiar with critiques of the method and the recensionist editorial practices that derive from it. Such critiques have been perpetuated since its earliest development, resulting in various procedural and objective-based adjustments. For instance, an almost universal shift towards securing a best text or a most authoritative extant witness to a textual tradition, rather than an approximation of an authorial original. More strident criticism may be found in Stephen Nichols's seminal introduction to Speculum's 1990 special issue on new philology. He suggests that, quote, recalling that almost all manuscripts postdate the life of the author by decades or even centuries, one recognizes the manuscript matrix as a place of radical contingencies, of chronology, of anachronism, of conflicting subjects, of representation. However, the stemma remains the primary way of representing how different manuscript versions of a text relate to one another. Sargan contends that stematics rests on two false principles. Quote, the principle of overdetermination, that although a given manuscript in a complex pattern of diffusion may demonstrate a number of conflicting agreements in common variation with various other manuscripts, it must be assigned a single location in the textual pedigree. And the principle of false optimism, that the smallest number of branches of diffusion must be the most probable. In other words, genealogical stemma, which represent manuscript relations as a downward-facing tree leading from a single unified original through a branching map in which each extant exemplar must derive from those higher up the branch, cannot account for the vicissitudes, disruptions, and abruptions that we know accompanied scribal copying practice. In stemma, manuscript copying can only ever be visualized as a practice of degenerative replication as each copy descends from the one before it, moving further away from the posited original. The visual rhetoric of the stemma cannot cope with either the possibility of coincident variation, in which two scribes in two different places could make the same mistake, resulting in unrelated copies that share variation, or with scribal emendation that results in a copy in which variants found in the exemplum have been altered to reflect an earlier state of the text. Nor can it cope with scribes who referred to multiple exemplars as they copied. William Langland undertook 3 significant revisions to Piers Plowman, resulting in 3 dramatically different traditions known as the A, B, and C text. Rather than choose between the traditions he encountered, Richard Osbarn, the 15th century scribe of Huntington Library MSHM 114, or the redactor of another manuscript earlier in its copying history, sought to harmonize the work by interpolating sections of A and C into his B text copy. The result is a hybrid text. It is impossible, therefore, to relate the manuscript neatly to any one of the 3 family groups. Integrating it into stematic representations requires that it appear more than once, or begin a new family of its own. As a result, the manuscript was rejected by editors as, quote, ruinously corrupt, and George Kane and E. Talbot Donaldson excluded its variants from their edition because including them would have, quote, more than doubled the size of the critical apparatus. The problem is also rhetorical. As Magnani and Watt pointed out in the quote I gave you earlier, in other words, the visual logic of arboreal stemma, which mirrors that of the genealogical tree, implicates manuscript reproduction in cis-heterosexist patrilineal cultural reproduction, with its structures of chrononormativity and compulsory heterosexuality. Stemmas engage in what Elizabeth Freeman terms the chronopolitics of development. It is at once regressive in its search for the mythologized original and positivist in its teleological ambition to plot change over time. The chronopolitics of development describes the ideological conditions that prompt supposedly post-imperial states to track and manage their own denizens through an official timeline, effectively shaping the contours of a meaningful life by registering some events like births, marriages, deaths, and refusing to record others like initiations, friendships, and contact with the dead. Such chrononormative moments and their registration in law, according to Judith Butler, are used to produce the unity and transmissibility of the nation. By reinforcing the state's power to confer recognition on its citizens, by arbitrating over who deserves recognition, and by tying the possibility of recognition to key moments in the normative white cis heterosexual life course, with a focus on the reproduction of white cis heterosexual subjects. Adrienne Rich identifies the mechanics through which compulsory heterosexuality produces women as compliant heterosexual subjects, and in doing so reduces them to such subjects. For instance, quote, it leads the daughter to accept incest/rape by her father, the mother to deny that it is happening, the battered wife to stay on with an abusive husband. For Sarah Ahmed, compulsory heterosexuality is, quote, the accumulative effect of the repetition of the narrative of heterosexuality. It shapes what it is possible for bodies to do, even if it does not contain what it is possible to be. Bodies take the shape of norms that are repeated over time and with force. Judith Butler frames compulsory heterosexuality in terms of the control and replication of culture, via the figure of the poor child, who queer kinship structures threaten to sever from the normative nuclear family. They observe, in relation to debates surrounding the provision of marriage-type contracts between non-straight couples in the mid-2000s, that homophobic defenses centering the rights of the child demonstrated anxieties surrounding, quote, the transfer and reproduction of culture, where culture carries with it implicit norms of racial purity and domination. Here, cultural reproduction is equated with the production of white, cis, straight children, who will go on to produce their own children within cis heteronormative family units where culture can be shared. The investment of cis heterosexist political establishment in the control and replication of culture is more overt when the object at stake is not the format of the family, culture itself. Might be incorporated into such structures do implicate queer design and cultural reproduction by restricting what queer can be. In legislation, Butler states, quote, desire and sexuality are ratified, justified, known, publicly instated, imagined as permanent, durable. But they are also limited to certain recognizable formations, those that look most like a head. Term. Quote, borrowing stem to the development scheme, a genetic logic comparable to that by which an acorn can only grow from an oak tree. The significance of a manuscript, in other words, predetermined by location on the stemma, which paradox used to decide whether it should bear textual. Whether or not a stemma is invested in the patriarchal model of the authorial original, whether or not the criteria by which foundation is recognized adjusted of the manuscript cultural production. Also, of it allowed. New statistics reminds us that the phylogenetic models it produces and textual data of historical realities. That they are, as Barbara Bordeo proposes, quote, an educated hypothesis created following a specific model, We must remember our training as humanists and understand that words and images have meanings and effects. Zhou Vishu concludes that what is needed are ways to, quote, conceive of familial lineages that disrupt, challenge, and reinvent the categories that have isolated and harmed queer diasporic subjects. For manuscript studies, we need ways to understand the relations between manuscript text and material text that disrupt their use in white supremacist and cis heteropatriarchal cultural production, and recognize their status as contingent, socially embedded, and relational cultural products. Sargan proposes the rhizome, which he imagines, quote, like a mushroom ring or a circular stand of larch trees, has multiple points of origin at the surface, branching and interconnecting in ways whose direction cannot be determined. This concept of non-hierarchical, unrooted interconnection allows Sargent to posit an edition of Nicholas Love's Mirror of the Blessed Life of Jesus Christ, where every manuscript text can be viewed in relation to every other by varying the base text depending on where the reader enters the rhizome. Sargent's model invokes Deleuze and Guattari's conception of the rhizome as a useful metaphor. But Deleuze and Guattari's rhizome is also prompted by book production, drawing on the bookwork that accompanied the making of 1,000 Plateaus. They understand the book as an assemblage that functions in relation to other things, other objects, including other books, but also dematerialized linguistic and social structures that function outside of and against predetermined hierarchies of power. Crucially, unlike the arborescent stemma, which figures the text as a self-sufficient reproductive entity, the rhizome recognizes the entanglement of actors and forces that come together in the production of a book as materialized text. There is no difference, proffer Deleuze and Guattari, between what a book talks about and how it is made. For trans and queer studies, the rhizome offers an alternative to the patrilineal reproductive logics that govern the arborescent family tree. Deleuze and Guattari describe the rhizome as, quote, an anti-genealogy that, quote, operates by variation, expansion, conquest, capture, offshoots, and liberation of sexuality not only from reproduction, but also from genitality. The rhizome offers a model for relationships that emerge from a breakdown in the natal family unit, that prioritize multiple variable connections, and that allow for discrepancy between the subjects and objects of affections, their modes of expression, and the overlapping forms of closeness these relationships entail. Trans people may experience time as a series of compressions, extensions, abruptions, the typical markers of the overdetermined straight cis life course: infancy, adolescence, marriage and divorce, children, retirement, etc., may be inaccessible, delayed, repeated, or skipped. The rhizome defies expectations that one's life and the relationships formed across it should be either temporally linear, descendant, or biologically guaranteed. Instead, it presents the possibility of relationships that are communally embedded, unconstrained, and fluctuating in connection across a lifetime. By introducing temporal and relational mobility to manuscript affiliations, we can imagine connections between multiple textual branches of a tradition. Such connections might change across a period of writing, reading, or ownership. For example, there is no longer pressure to place the 15th century manuscript of Piers Plowman, copied by Richard Osborne, into one familial group. Instead, we understand this copy of the text as connected to multiple groups, with priority given to particular connections at particular points. More importantly, the rhizome positions the manuscript in relation to objects and forces beyond the textual. Understanding the rhizome as a network of interconnected forces and actions working on people and objects allows us to consider each moment of manuscript production and transmission as situationally embedded. In the case of the harmonized peers, that might start with the acknowledgement that, as Wendy Scase has observed, the same sections of the C-text prologue were interpolated at a different point in another Piers Plowman manuscript. and that both manuscripts were copied by scribes associated with the London Guildhall. A manuscript rhizome centered on these manuscripts, then, might build a picture of the Guildhall copyists negotiating between different versions of the text and their own perceptions of authority. Such models exchange the abstracted text in favor of one that is materially situated. In doing so, they make explicit the socio-political structures of the Guildhall, the patron, and the exemplar that govern cultural production rather than visually participating in those structures. A rhizome has no beginning or end. It is always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. Very rarely in models of textual transmission can we evidence the root of a chain. Contrary to the chronopolitics of recensionist manuscript studies, which prefers to look for beginnings and ends, manuscripts operate from the middle. Embracing the in-betweenness means first dispensing with the idea of the manuscript as product, a complete endpoint from which we can assert textual or cultural authority. As Elaine Trahan shows, manuscripts may exist in many stages of completion at different points in their life, each of which can be figured by those they exist in relation to as a kind of wholeness. The rhizome allows us to understand not just scribal copying, but the manuscript itself as processual. It is enmeshed in the objects and forces, social, political, cultural, that brought it into being, and that continue to sustain it. Understanding a manuscript as process provides a better picture of the coming together of material and action. In the case of a copy of the Canterbury Tales belonging to Jean d'Angoulême, we encounter a manuscript that has been variously complete at different times in its making and use. The defective, but presumably wholly written text was corrected with reference to at least one, possibly two other manuscripts, with additional original compositions widening the manuscript rhizome from other manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales to a broader swathe of textual influences. A recensionist approach to the manuscript might discount those corrections or additions, or even the manuscript as a whole, but an approach that understands the manuscript as always in process could see this book as representative of a continuum of textual and material influence. The textual tradition, as represented by this manuscript, demonstrates the movement and availability of exemplars, the practices of readers not concerned with authenticity but with a particular vision of the reading experience, and the bookish aspirations of d'Angoulême as a patron who reread and perfected his books. Prioritizing manuscripts that demonstrated these extended relational networks might displace patriarchal authority in favor of diffuse and variable use. It provides a gateway for understanding reading as participant in the transmission of texts, while recognizing that the perspective of the scribe and the reader, or the scribe-reader, was always partial, limited, interrupted, and because of that could be creative and co-constitutive. In my book, I go on at this point to discuss the indigenous concept of the constellation as a way to temporarily stabilize and articulate the relationships involved in a single instance of manuscript production. Constellations are iterative, generative, and fugitive structures that allow us to prioritize particular knowledge systems in the way that we present and represent information. However, in this talk, I chose, perhaps a little self-indulgently, to prioritize my meditation on method over a fully worked example. For that, you will need to go refer to the book, which will be available in hard copy and open access online at the end of the month. What I hope to have shown here is that trans tactics are not only limited to the handling of overtly trans materials, and in fact that trans tactics may be productively used to unpick the cruxes caused by the methodological legacies the field has inherited, to produce richer, more diverse, and perhaps also more accurate accounts of the medieval record. Thank you. And I just have a slide to share. If anybody else is working on queer bibliographical approaches, the call for papers is currently open for our conference in the summer.
Thank you so much, JD, for a wonderful, very stimulating talk, exposition of this fascinating methodology. If anyone would like to has a question for our speaker, please uh, uh, feel free to type it into the chat, and we can read it aloud and have a bit of a discussion. Um, I appreciate the, well, first of all, the congratulations on the publication of your book, and the wonderful discount code for hard copy, which I think even with open access books, I think that hard copy, sometimes it's nice to have the hard copy, so that's wonderful that our participants can take advantage of that. I was wondering if you sort of teased at the very end um, the deployment of your method, or of this method, in some case studies, and you said, of course, that we will need to look at your book. I wonder if in a bit of the time we have remaining, if you could um, perhaps just give us a little bit more insight into sort of how you show this method in action. Of course, you did it in several cases in your talk, but I wonder if you would indulge us by speaking a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so one thing I do with the rhizome in particular and the constellation is think about how medieval people, how historically situated reading practices take advantage of these similar structures. And so, do I have a picture? Many people will be familiar with the Wound of Christ relics, bibliographic relics. So I think that's kind of in my camera view.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm talking about Kate Rudy's concept of wet touch and dry touch as a way of building a kind of rhizomic network in which queer and trans people who want to interact with that image in queer and trans ways can connect with one another without necessarily knowing one another. So there's a sort of a community distribution system.
And is that sort of one chapter, or is that how have you sort of integrated that into the book? Is that, are you,
That
you know,
is one chapter, yes. Because the historiography takes so much unpicking
sure.
on stematics and then how can we use the rhizome. I've sort of laid it out as here's an intervention into method and here's an example. And so I have that kind of structure twice in two chapters. So my odd numbered chapters are my more example focused ones, and my even numbered chapters are my more methodological historiographical ones.
Wonderful. Thank you. We have a question from Dot, who says, incredible talk. Thank you, so much to think about. I appreciate the focus on transbibliography / codicology on the embodiment of the textual object, and I'm wondering how you think that extends into the digital realm. How can transbibliography inform digitization of materials and how they are displayed online? A really stimulating question.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Dot, I know that you know Bridget Weirty and share parts of a brain. I'm writing a chapter with Bridget at the moment, and she keeps asking the same question. Because she's working on an archive of digitized trans and queer materials, and we're very interested in with the digital, can you move beyond explicitly trans materials to think of, in trans ways about other materials? I'm not sure I have a great answer, except that digitization has been vital for me to think about the kind of networks I was talking about earlier, where there's no possible way I would see all of those relics, but you can locate them a lot better with well-cataloged digitizations. One thing that I did last week was the Georgia Museum of Art has just bought a surface imager that does textural surface imaging at the kind of micrometer scale. And so thinking about those types of touch and contact, I'm really excited to see how touch how rough touch and wet touch show up on that kind of textural level. Um, and that is becoming a much quicker system. It's a one camera system, 6 lights. So I think digitization will shortly follow that kind of route.
So that will enable just for those of us less familiar with that tech, that will enable a sort of um, a kind of reading of the page of the surface of the folio that is sort of more informative about how it might have been used. Is that correct?
Exactly. So it's the setup is a single camera and then directed light sources, and it's essentially doing trigonometry to work out what is the surface texture here. Um, and it does that at a micrometer. I'm not sure it's at a nanometer scale, but like you can see much more surface detail than we can with the naked eye. So I'm
And and
interested to see what that.
does that work more sort of more effectively with parchment as opposed to paper, which is perhaps flatter and easier
I
to surface
sus
and doesn't carry as much sign of its use, perhaps in some way.
I suspect it will look different, but once you're at the nanometer scale, paper has quite a lot of texture, possibly in some ways more texture.
Right, right.
I know it's been used for watermarks before.
And we have a question from Faye Slacky. Thank you. This was fantastic. Do you think it would be possible to approach texts that have very few witnesses, or even perhaps fragments of texts with the proposed methodology?
Yeah, I think the thing that's the thing that drew me to the rhizome as a model, right, is that Deleuze and Guattari are interested in how all sorts of social and political and physical forces come together. That it's the scribe and also his environment and also the types of religious devotion he's active in all come together to constitute how a book is made. Um, and so I don't see any reason why you couldn't think about individual individual witnesses or fragments in similar terms. Um, I would also say this is just one sort of instantiation of how trans studies might help to think about manuscript method, and I think there are other critiques we could pose and other ways we could think about that as well.
And I see we have a question from Lynn.
Yeah, sorry. I should probably put this in the chat like everybody else, but it would take me too long to ask, I think. So you had an example of a manuscript of a pseudo Bonaventure's Life of Christ. And I actually thought a little bit about, in terms of the pictorial tradition, about the Vita Christi, and the complication of who's the author of these Vita Christi texts. It's a very contentious, with every text, almost like Ludwig of Saxony or the anonymous author of the Meditationes Vitae Christi. Everyone wants to identify an author, and I'm not convinced that there is such a thing for a textual tradition like the Vita Christi. So I'm wondering how, you're in this talk, you've talked a lot about the sort of the generation of the text, the movement of a text across time. What about, how does this apply to the concept of authorship, your methodology?
I think for texts like that, like you're sort of alluding to, this sort of Life of Christ texts that are all kind of intermeshed with one another and interlinked. I'm also not super interested in authorship or text in general. Don't tell my English literature students. And so I'm more interested in what people are doing with those texts now than than who way back when and originally first wrote the first little fragment. I think this builds around that interest in some ways, right? That it's not a tool that's going to help you work out authorship very easily, but it is a way of thinking about how parallel developments might happen or how those texts are enmeshed with one another, that they don't necessarily have to occupy different stemma, that they could all kind of come into relation in a more flexible way. That's not a very useful answer to the question, but it's all I have right now.
No, that's fine. It just seems that authorship is something that everybody wants to have an author for a text, and
Mhm.
I'm just wondering how, like, with an application of this methodology, can we finally sort of like make the author not as important, or take some of the focus away on that question that seems particularly hard to solve with medieval textual culture, more often than not, I think. Thank you.
And we have a question, another question from Dot, since we have a little bit of time here, and then a question following that one. So Dot says, sorry, another digital question. I love the rhizome approach to variant texts. Do you know if there are any tools available now that enable users to construct textual rhizomes, or is this a build your own situation?
I don't know a ton about network analysis and the tools that people are using to do that, but I am editing a chapter by Julia King on networks. So she knows a lot about that. And from what I understand from her chapter, the problem you would encounter that would make it an need to have a good IT programmer on your side type question, is that a lot of the free to use, easy to use networking tools require you to have two things of the same, two categories that you chart regularly. So you have to assign nodes one category of thing, and you have to assign connections another category of thing. So if your rhizome was all texts and scribes, great. You can make your two columns in a spreadsheet and generate a lovely network. But if you want to start thinking about more things, that's when you start hitting problems with any kind of easy to use software package.
Great. So Dot says, thank you. I'll talk to Julia. We also have a question from Sam Huener. I'm curious how you might describe the tension between ephemerality and endurance in a trans-bibliographic light. As the traditional schema is rigid and valuative based on all the cis/hetero/patriarchal norms, that obviously has an effect on what endures. I associate it also with having to do with the traditional assumption of endurance being the goal/end/ideal state of physical texts, and also with death/rebirth in the traditional versus trans sense. Do you have thoughts?
Mm. um, that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot with this book that I didn't really touch on in this talk is gaps in the archive and how you might read through or read with or learn to navigate gaps. There's some useful things that have happened in studies of the transatlantic slave trade on that model. Sadiah Hartman has an interesting concept of critical fabulation, in which you're not making up stories, but you're using what is there to help you imagine something that might be otherwise. So this kind of treading the line between what we can know, what it's what is the right thing to say? How is the right way to remember someone when the only record you have of them is violent and dehumanizing? And how you put that into critical terms is a problem that she's sort of thought out. And I think that might be one thing that could be useful, and thinking about how to do that in a bibliographical manner rather than a textual manner. Caden Henningsen has some thoughts about that. He uses artistic practice to think about the bibliographical process of remembering somebody. So that might be kind of one approach to this question. I'm also teaching a course for my graduate students, reteaching it for the second time in the spring, that thinks about novels that position trans characters as active in the archive as archivists or as librarians, and how that sort of can rewrite people into archival settings. So I'm not sure that really gets to the ephemeral, but it's a challenging question, and that's what I've got for you at the moment.
Wonderful. And we have a question from Stephen Ossadets. And Sam says, thanks, makes me think of dead collections. And Stephen asks, I want to follow up on what you were just saying in response to Dot about knowledge graphs. I can certainly see the implications of what you're saying for bibliographic practice, but could you help me imagine what a library or archival system built on these principles would look like in practice? If we move away from the dehumanizing hierarchies of original / derivative, et cetera, how might that change the tools or classificatory schemes that a researcher could use to navigate very large archives of millions of items?
My first caveat will be, I do not have an MLIS degree. I am not a librarian. So in terms of the logistics of organizing an archive, I don't have much experience on that side of things. And I would definitely recommend looking at the Homosaurus and the type of work that they're doing to think about archival categories and how you might recatalog to avoid some of those structures and circumvent them in various ways. And it's not an easy answer because vocabularies change much, much quicker than libraries possibly can. And so trying to make things findable in ways that people want to look for them is not easy. In terms of thinking about what a large archive might look like, there is an amazing archive at Tom of Finland House. It is not a large archive, it's a small archive, and it's integrated into the house in very specific ways because Tom, as he was known, had specific instructions about how his books should be stored and where they should be stored. And so some of them remain in specific rooms, and none of them have stickers on them. They all have kind of removable tags. But the archivist there, and I've lost her name. I know there are a few people on the call who have been to Tom of Finland House with me. If you remember her name, do drop it in the chat. The archivist there has introduced her whole own classification system because all of Tom's books would have ended up under the Library of Congress number for pornography. And there would be no way to distinguish between which ones are books of models that he used for drawing, which ones are his own books, which are kind of general interest. And so she set up her whole own classification system. So I think part of the answer is working out what works for specific collections and specific groups of readers and going from there, which is not a very helpful answer, but
Fascinating. And if there are any more questions, maybe we'll just give a few moments. We've got a little bit of time. Dot says that, Stephen writes, no, that was very helpful. Thank you very much. And Dot writes that the classification system, sorry, there's a lot happening in the chat. Reminds me of what Dorothy Porter had to do to classify African American books at Howard University. And Sam Hoyner follows up and writes, also not an MLS, but work in academic libraries. I tend to think of many smaller archives, not one very large one, as the goal and as a more workable idea. Each can be idiosyncratic to their people and materials. And Malcolm Noble writes that Marty Pike is the librarian at the Tom of Finland House. Wonderful. Well, we're getting close to time, so if there are no further questions, thank you very much, JD, for this very stimulating talk and for your book, which I know that many of us are looking forward to reading. It's, as you said, available open access currently or very shortly?
End of the month. By
the end of the month, and there's also the hard copy version, which you can order with a discount code. And can you remind us of what that the discount code was?
SAR50.
SAR50. So thank you so much.
Doesn't make it cheap, but it does make it cheaper.
Right. Excellent. And thank you all for attending. And please do make sure you're signed up to the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies mailing list, and stay tuned for our future programming and our future talks. So thank you again, JD, for a wonderful